They say the African river never lies, and when it calls your name, you must listen. But what if you don't, in a small African village where the talking drums speak before the roosters crow? There lived a girl whose laughter danced like sunlight on water. Her name was Adanna, and this is the story of how, at just 14, her life was scattered like dry leaves in the harmattan wind, and how, against all odds, she learned to gather them again. Beneath the shade of the great African silk cotton tree, the village children would often gather, their bare feet drawing shapes in the warm red dust. They played, argued and laughed until the sun bent low in the sky, spilling gold across the farmlands. Among them was Adanna, quick to smile, quicker to dream. She was the daughter of Mozi Okeke, a respected yam farmer, and Mama Ngozi, a woman whose gentle hands could coax life from even the most stubborn soil. Life in the village was not rich in coins, but it was rich in rhythm, the pounding of fufu in wooden mortars, the songs sung while weaving baskets, the smell of groundnut stew drifting from clay kitchens. Adanna loved it all. She dreamed of one day becoming their teacher, to bring wisdom back to the same dusty paths where she herself had once walked. But fate, like the African harmattan wind, sometimes changes direction without warning. One evening, the sky had just begun to darken when Mama Ngozi returned from the market. Her wrapper loosened from the long walk. She sat down, rubbed her temples and said nothing. Adanna noticed, but said nothing too, for in an African home, a child learns to read the silence of elders. By nightfall, her mother was coughing. By morning, she could barely stand. The village healer came, his bag filled with herbs and the smell of crushed leaves. He spoke softly to Mozi Okeke, but Adanna caught the weight in his voice. The sickness that had been passing through nearby villages had found their home. For days, Adanna sat by her mother's side, fanning her gently, feeding her pap, whispering the songs Mama used to sing. But the river of life has its own tide, and one misty dawn, Mama Ngozi's breath slowed, then stopped. The wail that rose from their mud-brick home that morning carried through the African hills. Women left their cooking, men dropped their hoes, children froze mid-play. In African tradition, the mourning of a mother is not hidden, it is a storm shared by the whole village. Adanna's world broke. Her father became a shadow of himself, speaking little, his hands rougher, his eyes colder, and somehow his grief turned to impatience at the way she moved. At the sound of her voice, at her very presence, one evening long after the burial. She returned late from school, her skirt dusty, her books clutched tight. She had stayed back to help her teacher sort old textbooks, but Mozi Okeke's voice cracked like a whip before she could explain. In his eyes, her delay was defiance. That night, the neighbors heard shouting, the sound of a cane striking the mat, and Adanna's muffled cries. It became a pattern, the weight of his sorrow finding its way to her skin. And each time she told herself, I will endure. I will not let this break me. Weeks passed, she began to spend more time at school, sometimes offering to sweep her teacher's house, sometimes reading under the tall mango tree until the sun bled into the horizon. Her teacher, Madam Ifeoma, noticed the sadness behind her polite smile one night. After another quarrel with her father, Adanna lay on her raffia mat staring at the ceiling. The moonlight spilled through the small window, drawing silver shapes on the wall. She thought of her mother's voice, "When the river calls, my child, follow it. It will never lead you astray." Before dawn, she packed her exercise books into a small cloth bag, wrapped her mother's scarf around her shoulders, and slipped out into the stillness. The cold African earth felt alive under her bare feet as she made her way to Madam Ifeoma's home. When the teacher opened the door and saw her, she didn't ask many questions. She simply pulled the girl into a warm embrace and whispered, "You are safe here." Life in Madame Ifeoma's home was not easy. There were chores, strict study hours, and little food, but it was peaceful. Adanna learned to wake with the crows, to sweep the compound before the sun touched the roof, to grind pepper in the mortar until her arms ached. She also learned to read faster, to solve sums quicker, to write her thoughts in neat, careful lines. Still, some nights the grief would return, heavy as wet cloth. She would step outside, stand under the moon, and whisper to her mother in the wind. One rainy season afternoon, the village prepared for the annual storytelling festival. Elders would gather under the silk cotton tree, their voices carrying the wisdom of ancestors. Madame Ifeoma encouraged her to take part in the youth storytelling contest at first. Adanna refused. She was shy, unsure, but her teacher said, "When you tell a story, you take control of the ending. Don't you want that?" So she stood before the crowd, the scent of wet earth and palm wine in the air, and began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger. She told the tale of a young African girl who lost her mother, whose father's grief turned to anger, who found refuge in the kindness of another. She spoke of rivers that whisper and harmattan winds that carry lessons, of pain that shapes strength. When she finished, the silence was deep. Then the applause came, not loud and wild, but steady and warm, like rain on a tin roof. That night, Mozi Okiki stood at the edge of the crowd. He had listened to every word, though she did not see him. He walked home slowly, the cane in his hand feeling heavier than ever. The next day, he came to Madame Ifeoma's home. They spoke for a long time. When Adanna appeared at the doorway, her father's eyes were wet. He took her hands, the same hands he had once struck, and said, "My daughter, I have been wrong. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it loosens its grip." Adanna returned to school, her father visiting often, sometimes bringing roasted maize or fresh palm oil. Years later, when she became a teacher, she often began her lessons with a proverb, "The African river never lies. When it calls you, follow, for it may lead you not where you wish to go, but where you are meant to be," and the children would listen, their eyes wide, never knowing that the story she told was her own.